Hello. Why are we here? Why are you here? Why are we doing a presentation? What is this presentation for?
Stop having an existential crisis.
You know a little bit about that, Julie. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. An existential crisis is when you are starting to question the meaning of life and really everything. This relates mostly to an existentialist point of view on the world. Existentialism is that we give meaning and create meaning to life on our own. Friedrich Nietzsche was a nihilist, which was a much more off-the-end version of existentialism. He took it even farther to be that there is no meaning to life whatsoever. And then there's Jean-Paul Sartre. He believed that we are born without an essence. An essence is this innate meaning to life or to things that give it what its purpose and function is. So he believed people were not born with an essence, but we create it as we go on, meaning we create the meaning to our lives as we live. And this ultimately became the framework for existentialism in the future. This was extremely revolutionary for the time because before people relied heavily on religion and others for creating who they were or relying on who they were and what their meaning to life was. Existentialism, though, does not mean atheism. Many existentialist thinkers were theists, meaning they believed there was a God and that God created everything, but without any inherent meaning or purpose behind that creation. A lot of existentialism also deals with this idea of the absurd, meaning that we are searching for answers in an answerless world, which happened a lot with people after World War II, that around that time, after the war, people were dealing with the aftermath and chaos that had happened, and it was hard for them to find meaning and goodness in a world that didn't seem to have any in it. Existentialism also focuses on the notion of freedom, a little bit different than the freedom we're used to today. Sartre put it that it's an extreme kind of, again, that we are then creating our own moral code as well, and invent our own morality, since there is no guide for us to follow. It's almost too much freedom to a fault, is kind of how he viewed freedom with this point of view. Also that there is no true authority, that there's no one we can rely on for giving us meaning or purpose, that all authority figures are, like religious leaders or politicians, really are just people just like us finding out meaning on their own as they live. And then authenticity is also quite relevant to existentialism, that it is learning how to live and recognize the full weight of our freedom in light of the absurd. Again, existentialism is a lot about creating our own meaning for ourselves. And another existentialist thinker that is widely known is Albert Camus. He wrote a book called The Plague. You read that book, didn't you?
I did, and it's actually pronounced Albert Camus. Thank you very much. Albert Camus was a French philosopher and thinker born in 1913 in a French colony in Algeria. He grew up in very poor neighborhoods with a strict Catholic grandmother, and in a household that was very pessimistic and thought very fatalistically, which gave him his perspective on the world for the rest of his life. He was diagnosed at a young age with tuberculosis, and because of this, spent a lot of time reflecting on his mortality and his existence and his purpose, and because of his Catholic background then, was asking many theological questions that he continued to ask throughout his entire life. Many of those questions come out in some of his works, including The Plague. He was strongly influenced by Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Heidegger, and yet his own philosophical views later on in his life differed enough that he could not really be considered a proper existentialist thinker, but he was similar. He died in a car crash in 1960. He wrote many works, many plays, and many books, and one of his most famous books is The Plague, written in 1947. Quickly, to explain the story, the story of the plague takes place in Oran, in Algeria. It's a French town that suddenly is swept with the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, as some people know it best. So the town is immediately closed off to the outside world, and many of the characters are cut off from their loved ones outside of the town, and the deaths keep rising throughout the story. It's very depressing, and many of the main characters have to respond to this plague in several different ways.
How so?
Well, Camus presented 3 ways that he thought was most important to react to in a reaction to the absurd. And the plague, the absurd for Camus was the power of the plague and everyone's own inevitable doom. So Camus states that there was 3 ways to react to this. You could either commit suicide and die. You could take a leap of faith and believe in a divine order or divine being of some sort. Or you could simply accept the absurd, accept your own inevitable doom, and create meaning for yourself. And each character in the book does one of these things.
Hearing the summary of this book, it sounds like the book deals a lot with these topics of suffering and death, the absurd, and exile or separation from others. Can you expand on how that relates to existentialism?
Yes, these are only a few of the themes in the plague. But for sure, suffering and death is one of the most prevalent ones. You can tell by the title, The Plague, and throughout the book and the story. But Camus, when he speaks of the plague, does not only mean the sickness that comes through the town, he also means it as death or suffering that is an inherent part of the human condition and that must be fought against, and that is something that brings a lot of suffering into the world. Camus speaks of the absurd and talks about looked upon by an uncaring universe. Why would you fight the inevitable? Well, Camus states throughout the story in The Plague that you should fight, but you should mostly fight to bring healing, and that is what's most important. And Camus uses exile as an image of the plague, i.e. death as the inherent human condition, separating the town from the world and characters from their loved ones. And the entire town is in the same situation. They are all exiled together in the story, but everyone seems to be taking their suffering as unique, and no one else can understand how they feel. But yet, Camus is saying, if you just accept your state of exile and the plague, but you fight against it, only then you will be able to find a true personal sense of freedom.
This sounds a lot like postmodernism.
Yeah? How so?
Well, again, back around the time of World War II, people were reacting to the war and what life meant after the war and dealing with all the chaos that had happened. And it was, again, hard for them to find any good meaning to life. Before this, with modernism, people were very much on a pursuit for expanding knowledge and creating new things, which ultimately ended up leading to the wars that happened. And postmodernism is now very much against authority, because authority before was the people who were leading them towards this progress that was ultimately self-destructive. And that in postmodernism, that they believe there's no real one true answer to anything or true solution. And with postmodernism, there's this idea of like a hybrid self, that it's not just you anymore who defines who you are. You're part of a group, and that meanings change as they affect the group. A lot of postmodernism reminds me too of this idea of an angsty teenager who is rebelling against their parents and really questioning everything, and in the pursuit of doing what makes them feel right and what makes them feel good.
So, what is the meaning of things, Julie?
Whatever you want them to be.